Welcome to my Sustainability and Crafting lecture. Today I'm going to be talking to you about something that I've been working towards for about the last 10 years, and that has to do with just being more mindful about how my craft sort of intersects with environmentalism, sustainability, production of waste, things like that. So I want to start with the disclaimer of I've been working towards this for 10 years. I'm in no way trying to say that I do it perfectly or that you should do exactly what I do. More than anything, I kind of just want to talk through the points that I go through in my head and give you a jumping off point if this is something that resonates with you that you're interested in. So it's not at all an all or nothing thing, and it's nothing to do with you're doing better or worse than anybody else. But I've kind of broken this down into 6 things. I'm going to give you a little overview of them now, and then I'm going to dive deeper into each one of those 6 in the lecture. So the first one has to do with materials in. So when you're doing a craft, pretty much any kind of a craft, this lecture is going to be focused more on sewing and the yarn crafts, so knitting, crochet, spinning, weaving, and felting, just because those are the crafts that I do. But this is going to be an approach that would work with pottery, with gardening, with really lots and lots of hobbies and craft sort of things. So the first thing to think about is materials in. Where do your materials come from? My personal take on it after doing some reading and spending some time here is going to be that I'm always going to start with secondhand or found materials or repurposed materials if those are available to me. So for instance, these are our like kitchen towels instead of paper towels, and the back of these is a sheet that ripped and no longer would stay on our bed. And the front of these are bath towels that would fray in the wash on the corners after being used for several years. So these are all, I consider them sort of found materials or repurposed materials, but there are a lot of different places to get your materials from. So first step is materials in. Where do they come from? How do you find sustainable brands? How do you look for secondhand options? Where can you source those things from? The second thing is going to be, once you have your materials, is there some way you can plan your project to use as much of those materials as possible? So for instance, this is a knitting project that I started a long time ago, and it's with some hand spun yarn. And what I did is I'm pulling from both ends of this ball of yarn, and what that's going to allow me to do is I started at the narrowest point of the shawl and I'm just getting bigger as I go. Since I'm working from both ends of the yarn, I'm just going to be able to knit this until I run out of yarn, and when I have only just enough to bind off, I'm going to be able to bind off, rather than doing it a different way, binding off when I hit the point when it's the size that it's supposed to be, and having a quarter of a ball of yarn left over that then I'm going to have to find something else to do with. If you think ahead of time about how you can most effectively use the materials that you have, this is going to generate less waste to start with, and you'll get more enjoyment or more projects out of the same materials that you started with, so you won't need as many. So after we have our materials and we've planned for how we're best going to use them, you are almost always going to have some amount of scrap left over. Garment sewing is especially bad for this, and they're often weird little shapes of fabric. But with knitting and crocheting as well, you almost always have a little bit of yarn left over for that. So I think it's good to have like an arsenal of projects that use little pieces of fabric or yarn left over. Kind of have some favorites that you know what those might be. So I love projects like this that have smaller, especially like slightly weird shaped pieces that work well regardless of what sort of colors and shapes you have left. So we're going to be talking about some of my favorite scrap busters. There are a million different ways to use scraps. And of course you want to pick the ones that you're actually going to use and enjoy making so that you actually do them, but sort of getting in that mindset of, okay, these are the scraps that I have, what am I going to do with them, and then organizing your scraps to let you really achieve those things is going to be a great way to make sure that they really get used. The last thing that has to do with sort of physicalities of making your project is going to be how you get your materials out at the end. It doesn't matter how fantastic you are at planning and at scrap busting, you will absolutely always generate something at the end that you are not going to use. Whether this is because you lose interest in a craft, because you purchased materials at a time when you had different preferences than you do now, because you inherited a lot of supplies, at some point every crafter will have materials left at the end. And then we're gonna talk about what's the best way to move those out of your life to get them into the hands of somebody who really can use them. And then you can feel good about letting them go, that they're gonna go to a new home. Because holding on to scraps or materials that you know you're never going to use is a great way to make you not feel great about your craft and prevent those materials from ever getting used. So don't just throw them in your craft room and leave them forever. At least for me, that kind of feels like it stifles my creativity a little bit. So the next two are going to be a little bit more, the last two things that we're going to talk about are going to be a little bit more metaphysical maybe. And the first one has to do with using your craft to make things that you need that will allow you to be more sustainable in other areas of your life. So the first two that I could grab were my little snack bowls. I actually made these for one of our kiddos' birthdays. Instead of paper or plastic plates, we made them little snack bowls, and thought we've got many years of kid birthday and gatherings that these will work for, and they're machine washable, but also they work for like picnics and car seats. So this was a thing that let me not buy a single use disposable item that I created with my craft. And so that was something that felt like I was using my craft to help increase my sustainability in other areas of my life. Another way that this can happen has to do with maybe not necessarily something that's replacing a single-use item, but it may just be something that you would have gone out and purchased new if you didn't make it. And this may almost fall into the category of like mending. So if you tear your pants, instead of going to the store and buying new pants, you can mend the pants that you already have, and that prevents you from needing to buy a new thing, while still sort of using your craft or the crafting materials that you have. And the last thing is packaging. Unless you buy absolutely everything secondhand, a lot of your crafting supplies themselves will come in packaging that then you'll have to deal with. And then there's also the element of if you are gifting the things that you're making or selling the things that you're making, they need themselves to be in packaging. And we have come up with several things in our business that I think are a little bit unusual along these lines. When we are selling our kits, we actually worked with our local racket club to reuse their empty tennis ball tubes, and every kit that is just one ball of yarn will fit perfectly inside one of those. So this is another sort of thinking outside the box in terms of what do you generate in your house already that you could reuse, what could be done with the packaging that your products come in, and then what could you do maybe with those packages, maybe with different packages to get those gifted or sold if that's something that you work towards. So I hope that this is a good introduction. I'm also going to be talking in pretty much all of these segments about the sort of mental shift that comes with when you're ready to start a new project or take on a new craft, which I am the queen of. I love finding a craft that I get enthusiastic about and I want to try it right away. Sort of making that shift to think, what can I use that I already have? Instead of I need to go buy something new. And that mindset shift I think goes a long way towards this. And I know a lot of this stuff can feel a little bit like you're being denied something. You're not supposed to go out and buy new things or use certain types of products. And I don't want it to feel like that. For me, a lot of it allows me to be more creative, to have those limitations on there and really practice that outside the box thinking. And it's not that I don't buy new things and things specifically for my crafts, but to kind of think through the process, I think has really allowed me to be more creative and really enjoy learning a lot of new crafts without feeling that need to sort of be perfect at them or get a bunch of materials and expense before I even get started. So I hope that you enjoyed the lecture, and I'm going to delve into all 6 of those categories in more detail in just a minute. The first thing that I wanted to talk about with sustainability and crafting has to do with where we get our materials from. I think that this is probably, as crafters, the thing that we can make the biggest environmental impact, and the sort of the biggest place that we can implement sustainability has to do with where our materials come from. And again, this is not an all or nothing, so this doesn't have to be the only place you ever get materials from. But I also am a bit of a thrill of the hunt kind of a person, so I do find it more satisfying to get my materials from slightly unusual sources rather than someplace where you're guaranteed to find exactly what you want. But I know that that's not everybody's passion, so that's okay as well. But I just want to run through kind of my order of operations when I am looking for something to do a project. The first place that I am always going to start anytime I'm looking to start a new project is things that I already own that are already in my house that I'm not using anymore. So if you're talking about yarn, if you're talking about a knitting or a crocheting or a weaving project, this may be your stash. This may be the bin of leftover yarn if you have such a bin in your house. Someplace a little bit unusual, but that I certainly have done before, is if I knit something or crocheted it at some point in the past and I no longer love that thing, it turns out I didn't wear the sweater or whatever it was that used to be, I have been known to unravel it. If I loved the yarn but I didn't love what it was, or I did love it, I just don't love it anymore, I've been known to unravel that yarn. And then if you're talking about sewing for fabric, things you already have in your house, maybe the example that I gave in the introduction, I had an old sheet and some old towels, and I tend to have a place in my house where I put things like that. Clothes that are too worn out to donate, things like linens that are too worn out to donate. I tend to have a place in the house where those live, and so that's going to be the first place if I want to make, this is my, instead of a paper towel, these are unpaper towels that live in the kitchen, and I have a whole bunch of them. I don't know, I probably have 20 of them. So that may be a place that you can start, or just like with knitting, or crochet, if you have the bag of ends of balls of yarn. For sewing, I have a scrap bag, and so the project that I wanted to do for this one was I wanted to make a magnetic fishing game for my kids after they played one and enjoyed it. And I had a bunch of scraps left over from sewing wool diaper covers for them, a bunch of weird shaped little scraps of wool that I cut into fish shapes and sewed washers to that we owned, and magnets that we owned to create the magnetic fishing game. So kind of start in that place. Do I have anything in the house already that I could use to make this? That's kind of my first go-to with materials in. My next go-to is always going to be secondhand. To me, once the item already exists and the resources have already been put into creating that item, I would much rather use that item again as many times as possible before it's either recycled or thrown in the trash, depending on what it's made from. And so in that realm, there are a lot of options for secondhand. There are things like a garage sale and mainstream thrift shops, like a Goodwill if you're in the US, Salvation Army, all kinds of places like that. There may be a local thrift shop or vintage shop. But then there are the slightly unusual secondhand options. In the Indianapolis area where we are, there is a great sort of creative reuse space called Recraft, which is basically a thrift store specifically for craft supplies. And there, I think there are similar shops in at least a lot of larger cities that are tailored specifically for creating things with. And so that can be a fantastic place to look if you have such a thing. There are also very specific and maybe a little bit harder to find things. We've been to architectural salvage sales, estate sales, things like that. But also there are events run a lot fairly locally or in the largest city near you. There was one over the summer last year where all of the architects in the Indianapolis and I think all of Indiana, they get a lot of samples, sample tiles, sample flooring, sample wallpaper, sample all of that stuff. And they all donated it to this architecture, get it for free, prevent stuff going to the landfill sale. And anyone, it was open to the public, it was only advertised online, and you could go and get books of wallpaper samples, and we got tons of little floor tiles, like squishy materials that the kids like to play with, things like that. So there's definitely something to be said for being involved in that secondhand and sustainability community in your local or slightly larger than local area, depending on how small an area you're in population wise. To just be aware when those kinds of things are happening, because there really are a lot of them around, and that can be a great place to get all kinds of really interesting things. Something else that I do a lot of, I'm pretty involved in our local Buy Nothing group, and that is truly anytime anyone has something that they no longer need, they can put it up. They're generally hyper-local Facebook groups. And anytime you need something, you can put it out there and see if anybody happens to have it. So I got 70 baby food jars. We use these for paint pots. We use these for mixing dye colors. You can use them for absolutely all kinds of things. I'm a sucker for tiny little jars too. So if you may check and see if there's a local Buy Nothing group or any kind of a local group for like garage selling, things like that, because that's a great place to get not only secondhand things but very affordable kinds of things. And obviously the more affordable your craft supplies are, the more either time you'll have to do your craft, or the more budget that you'll have left over for sort of the special odds and ends that go along with that. Another thing that you can do is go to secondhand shops and buy things that were not specific to craft supplies. So this, for instance, was a scarf that had some unraveled, like the fringe was all messed up on it, and I sewed it very inexpertly into a gardening sweater, and I put a giant pocket that I could put my phone in to listen to podcasts while I was gardening. So don't feel like if you're going to secondhand shops you have to look for bolts of fabric there, because they may not have that exact thing. And last but not least on the secondhand thing, if you talk enough about sustainability and liking to reuse things, and you're known as somebody who does crafting things amongst your group of friends or in your general community, people will reach out to you with opportunities. People like to reuse things and give things a home, especially in circumstances where they don't know what else to do with it. So there was a costume shop shutting down, and they were going to throw away just bolts and bolts of fabric. They were going to throw them in the dumpster. And one of the women that was involved with that costume shop said, "Hey, I know somebody who might want that." And she got in touch with me, and I said, "Yes, let me come and fill my car up." And I distributed it to the secondhand craft supply store, and kept some of it for my use as well. So there's definitely something to be said as well for asking other people, or just being known for somebody who can use these things, because a lot of people would like to give them to somebody who can use them. They just don't know how to find that person. So that person could be you. And after I've exhausted my options for secondhand opportunities, there are certainly lots of great sustainable small businesses that are worth supporting in the crafting community. And I definitely, for me personally, if I'm going to purchase new, that's certainly something that I think about. I prefer to work, my personal preference is to work with small businesses first. I just think in general that supporting those within the crafting community is something that's important almost outside of sustainability for me. But as well, if you're working with a small business, a lot of those are run out of homes or small spaces instead of having the huge factories and overhead like that are, and the warehouse space and all of the employees and all of those things. Generally, you're going to have just a smaller, more compact thing, which is going to use fewer resources. So for me, I kind of prefer small over anything else. But again, everybody needs, when you're talking about sustainability, everybody's going to have their own list of things that are important to them, and you should put that list in whatever order they are for you in terms of order of importance. So for me, I like to go small if I can. If not, I like to go bigger, but that has a more of a reputation for being green and sustainable. And there are lots and lots of lists online for sort of what those places are. And that a sort of larger company that's just well known for their positive sustainability practices is going to be the last place that I would go. And I will say for me personally, the very, very large craft supply stores, the large box stores, are not a place that I personally choose to shop for my craft supplies, partially because of the sustainability aspect of that, partially because I like to be able to ask questions of people a little bit more to understand where they're coming from and where their materials come from, and that's just not so much of a possibility in those places. So that is the sort of the steps in the order that I go through when I'm choosing my materials for projects, and I hope that you found that helpful. The next thing that I'm going to talk about is using as much of the materials that you have as it's possible for you to use. This works whether you've purchased new materials or whether you're using secondhand. Obviously, if you purchase new materials, you have a little bit more control over how much fabric or yarn that is coming in, versus secondhand. A lot of times you're not necessarily going to have so much control. The amount that there is how much you're going to bring in. But in either of those two cases, you really can sort of stop and look at what you have, think about the project that you wanted to do, and spend just a few minutes before you get started thinking about what can I do to optimize how much of this material I use so that I waste less of it. So the first thing I've already talked about a little bit has to do, this is a knitted project. And when you're doing something like a shawl or a scarf where exact size doesn't so much matter, generally for me, what I do is I just keep going until I run out of yarn, or until I get pretty close to running out of yarn. Obviously you need enough to bind off or to make the fringe or to finish your warp if you're weaving, whatever the case may be. So don't go right to the end. But if the pattern says to make this until it measures 50 inches long, but you have a little bit of yarn left over, and you don't have another thing in mind for this yarn, make yours until it measures 60 inches long. You can just keep going. And that way you'll actually get some more use out of your item, and get to enjoy the yarn and use more of it doing that project, rather than have some that just gets sort of wasted or not used as much. Again, sticking in the knitting and crocheting realm, if you're doing something like socks, mittens, fingerless mitts, anything where there's two of them, sleeves of a sweater, whatever there may be two of, what you can actually do is divide your yarn in half, and you can do this by weight. I weigh my items a lot, so you can sort of wind into a ball until you get to 50 grams out of a 100-gram ball, or whatever your amount that you start with is, or you can kind of eyeball it, or you can pull from both ends of the yarn, and then you don't have to measure it at all. This does come with its own challenges. You do tend to get more tangles when you work from two ends of the same ball of yarn. But when I am doing something like socks, I will almost always start at the toe. I will knit the socks, go ahead and put the heels in there, and then I'm just going to go until I run out of yarn. If I don't have another project idea in mind for that yarn, I'll just make the cuffs as long as I can make them. I'm always cold, in the winter at least, with my feet. So a longer cuff, I can just fold it down. I'm going to get more use out of that yarn than a quarter of a ball of sock yarn left that I don't really have a specific plan for. Obviously, if you do something special with your leftover sock yarn, I'm not saying that you have to do this, but if you don't have another plan or project in mind for the leftovers, it could be useful. to do that. So I do the same thing, like I said, for mittens or gloves. I'll start at the top and work my way down. That way I can make them just as long as I want to down this way. Something else that you could do would be plan to make another second smaller pair. So if you have enough yarn left over and you have a kid in your life, or a doll or stuffed animal that you like to make things for, that can be another good way to kind of use up that last little bit. This is a weaving example of the, I just kept making this wider until I ran out of all the scraps that I kind of wanted to use up. So I had a big bag of scrap yarn that was all the same thickness that I was going to weave for the blanket, and I let the amount of scraps that I had determine how wide my blanket was. So it was this wide because this was how much yarn was in the bag, and I just kept going until I'd used it all. So you're allowed to let your yarn, the amount of yarn that you have, sort of determine how big your project is going to be. Very similarly to that with fabric. So if you're doing some sewing, these started life as a sheet that we got from a secondhand store, and then was a sheet on our bed until it ripped. We kind of wore it out. And then it was diaper wipes for our children. We had 2 kids go through cloth diapers. The last one was potty trained a month ago. First time in 5 years that I haven't been changing diapers. But the number, I didn't have a specific number of diaper wipes that I needed, but this was how much fabric I had. I just had the whole sheet worth of fabric. So that was how many wipes I made. I basically cut it into as many pieces as I could get out of the piece of fabric. And that's what determined how many I was going to make. I did the exact same thing with the kitchen paper towel replacements, the unpaper towels. I cut up the fabric that I had until I didn't have any more to cut up, and that determined how many I made. Because you can never have enough wiping devices, especially if you have toddlers in your house. The last example that I'm going to use is going to be garment sewing. This is the only example that I actually had purchased new fabric for, or new supplies for. Everything else was sort of using what I had available. But these are family swimsuits, because I'm obnoxious and all of my family has matching swimsuits now. Most of this was because so swimsuit fabric was not something I could easily find secondhand. So I did purchase this new, although I did get it from the remnants bin kind of a thing. So I didn't really get to pick how many yards I got. It was just, this was how much it came in. So I actually got it for myself I made myself a swimsuit with it. And so I did the suit and the liner for myself out of it. And before I started cutting, I laid it all out. I had all of my pattern pieces for every swimsuit, for every member of my family. And I just played with it for a while to see how many things I could fit. And I turned things a different way, and I flipped them over to the other side so that I could really optimize the use of the fabric. And so in addition to my suit, which was what I bought the fabric for, I also made a rash guard for my husband, who is the yarn dyer at our booth, Nomad Yarns. And then I made a rash guard for our smaller kid. And then I ran out of that particular swimsuit fabric and made bottoms for our kids with some other fabric that I also have a matching suit for. But by spending the time to lay everything out, lay the fabric and the pattern pieces all out before I started cutting, it really did let me get, if I hadn't have rearranged them, I wouldn't have been able to get pieces big enough to do the adult or the kid rash guard size out of that. I would have cut my pieces in a little bit of a different way, and then I would have just had swimsuit scrap fabric, which isn't the most useful for making things that are not swimsuits. So spending the time to kind of lay things out and think about, okay, what else might I want to make out of this fabric before I cut anything, may let you get a couple of extra garments out of that, which can make a really big difference. So just planning on how to use the most of your materials to have the fewest scraps left over, or to have scraps in more useful sizes and amounts before you generate them can make a big difference to how much waste you're generating and how many materials need to be produced for you to do your craft. We have talked about how we can bring materials in more sustainably, and how we can plan to use those materials before we get started to generate as least waste and use the least of them as we need. Now I want to talk about what we do with what's left at the end, the scraps. It doesn't matter how well you plan, almost doesn't matter. I'm sure that you could be very, very good about it and generate virtually no scraps. But most people who do a lot of crafting are going to generate some amount of scraps. I personally have a gigantic bag, it's a big blue bag, that lives under my sewing cutting space where I just shove all of my fabric scraps as I create them. And I have a big clear glass jar that I throw all of my partial balls of yarn left into. So most people are going to generate some amount of scraps as they work. What I want to talk about now is give you a couple of ideas from what I do about how scraps can be used. There are almost an unlimited supply of possibilities, things that you can use your scraps for. But mostly what I want to stress is the part about using your scraps that matters is how are you going to use your scraps. Once you know that, organize your scraps that way. So if you know that you're going to use every sewing scrap you make to stuff things, keep them all in one big giant spot because you're going to use them all to do that. If you are going to use your quilting cotton scraps to do X project and your stretchy fabric scraps to do Y project, separate them that way. If you like to do, you like to have projects that you use your bigger scraps for versus things that you do with your smaller scraps, organize them that way. As I'm going through all of these things, think about what a good fit for you might be, things that you think you'd actually do with your scraps, and then set yourself up for success by organizing your scraps that way so that they're easy to grab and do that project. So a couple of scrap projects that I have done and continue to like to do. I've already talked about the little fish game. Kid stuff can be really good with scraps because kids are by definition smaller than adults. At least mine, I have a 2 and a 4-year-old, so my kids are much smaller than me. Not only do I make things from scraps for my kids, so their clothes, their toys, even like dolls and doll toys and little bags and things for them. But also the kids like to do crafts with me. So this was my 4-year-old's beautiful creation. And this entirely came out of my scrap bag. So she likes to sort of go through there and pull things out and we can make things together. Thus, I do not need to buy art supplies for her because going through my scrap bag is like a big adventure hunt for her. The bag that the fish toys live in is actually also scraps, as is the ribbon that it came from. So when you need something to store the things that you are making in, scraps can be a useful thing for that as well. Any sort of project that uses small pieces where mix and match colors and fabrics wouldn't be a problem can be good. These can be, so this is going to work well for polar fleece. If you know you like to make a lot of these kinds of gifts or for donations, keep all of your polar fleece scraps separate from other things. Keep all of your wool scraps separate from other things, however that works. Again, fabric scrap wise, this is a big floor poof cushion that I have started. I've created the yarn, it's a crochet piece. I'm actually teaching a class on this as well over this weekend, where you're actually turning any fabric scrap that I have that's like a long piece or something obviously that I can cut or tear to create a long piece. I'm turning that into the thick fabric yarn and then using that to make a giant thing, a rug or a poof. You can actually do the exact same thing with yarn. So this is a completed one that obviously is big and it can be like a floor cushion or a footstool or whatever. And that is, again, it uses a bunch of scraps of yarn and they can be all different thicknesses and colors and textures and materials and all of that turn it into giant thick yarn, and make it into a large piece that you want to do. So keeping in mind, maybe having 3 or 4 projects that you do a lot with scraps can be a big use for you. Another thing that you can do with scraps is sort of look at the scraps that you have generated. If you've just finished a project, what are scraps that you tend to have a lot of? And then you can actually plan projects specifically to use those scraps up if it's something that you're generating a lot of. So this particular project, I'm making a puff quilt, or sometimes called a biscuit quilt. I'm actually using a variety of different backings that you're not going to see. There's a lot of sheets. There's a lot of old sheets in my life, but you're not going to see that part. But importantly, I actually picked this project because I had a lot of batting, just like little strips and odd shaped pieces that I'd cut larger quilts out of the batting, and so I was able to cut that all into small squares and use that to stuff the puffs. So I actually picked this project because I wanted to use the massive amount of weird shaped batting scraps that I knew that I wasn't going to use for anything else. So you can go either way. You can kind of say, okay, I want a footstool, what can I use to make a footstool? Or you can say, I have a lot of batting scraps, what do I want to make with those? But I think thinking through that, especially in how you organize your scraps, is really going to be helpful. I think the biggest issue with using scraps is it feels like a chore to do that. Whereas if you think through it, plan ahead of time, and have things really separated out, it can kind of be an exciting challenge more than a like I have to go through this huge amount of thing, or I'm just going to throw it all in one place and then throw it away at the end. So I think it's a fun mental sort of exercise to think, what can I do with these things that I've generated to get some use out of them while using up something that I already have. We've gone through the basics of kind of making the assumption that you are going to progress through your crafting, as in I want to buy my materials, decide how to use them, make the thing, use up the scraps. Now we're going to talk about how do you get the things that you may not have used out and back into the world. And I think that this can be a real sticking point for people, and so this may be sort of a slightly more advanced sustainability goal that you want to work your way towards. But I think there is a real challenge for a lot of crafters in wanting to save everything, and I definitely fall into this category, hence my gigantic bag of fabric scraps. Many of them are like this big. And if you have a use for them, you should keep them. You shouldn't get rid of things that you are going to use just for the sake of getting rid of them. So I take my tiny little pieces and I use them to stuff my giant floor cushions. However, there have been many crafting supplies over the years that I knew that I was not going to use. For instance, I started quilting when I was 17, and my tastes when I was 17 for the type of fabrics that I liked and that I bought was different than my tastes are now as a 35-year-old. And so it was very hard for me to give myself permission to look at those fabrics and say, I do not want to use the unicorn fabric to make a dress for myself. And to give myself permission to pass that along to somebody else who is going to use it. But I think with crafting, I think it can be very good for the crafter to get those things out of your space. Because I know for me, again, for me especially, I can develop a bit of a mental block about, I don't even want to go into my crafting space because it's so cluttered and jammed full of things I know I'm not going to use. But I feel guilty getting something new and starting a new project because I know I should be using the things that I already have. So I am here as a position of not authority at all to give you permission to get rid of things that are making you miserable that you know you don't want anymore. It is okay. It doesn't make you wasteful or not sustainable or environmentally friendly or any of those things to say, I'm not going to use these. I want to get them into the hands of somebody who is. So first step, you have permission to get rid of them if you know you're not going to use them. You also have permission to keep them if you have a project in mind and you just haven't gotten there yet. But once you've decided that this thing needs to leave, it's good, I think, to have an avenue where you like to take things. Probably the easiest and most straightforward place to take supplies that you no longer need would be a general thrift store, like a Goodwill, or whatever is local to you. The issue with that is a lot of those are not necessarily, it kind of depends on what the craft is. A lot of those, so if you're looking at pieces of fabric, those may end up in textile recycling at the larger thrift stores just because they don't have an avenue for selling them as fabric for sewing. So that is kind of something to be aware of a little bit in terms of, is this something that's going to be easy to resell as is at the kind of shop that you're donating to. A fantastic option is if you have a creative reuse place or like the Recraft in the Indianapolis area, and I know that there are very similar stores that are craft material specific secondhand stores, can be a fantastic place to go ahead and donate those. Things again like the Facebook Marketplace, or if you have like a neighborhood garage sale or just a neighborhood group where people are sort of swapping things. Again, I cannot speak highly enough of the Buy Nothing project. If you're not familiar with it, that's another great place to say, okay, I have a full set of my scrapbooking materials that I loved to do but am no longer using. Who would like them? Who can give those a good home and actually be able to use them? Another place that we have taken things has been to like assisted living facilities and places like that, or senior centers. Or elementary schools, like art teachers, things like that. They often can really use and really appreciate materials like that, again, depending a little bit on the materials. But I think almost deciding early on, where am I going to establish this relationship and kind of have an avenue out for your things, so that it's one less decision to make. When you're finished with something, okay, what do I do with this now? And to have a box or a bag or whatever it is, and store it all there until you can take it to that place, so it doesn't feel like making decisions about every item individually. But I think planning that ahead of time, where are things going to go when I'm done with them, can definitely be a useful exercise. Another slightly different thought process has to do with sort of the end of life. So it's not that you have a full set of something that is still useful that needs to find a new home, but you have used up something. What are you going to do with it? So it can be, if you're very sustainable of the sustainable mindset, a little bit more involved in that, you can even think about things like if you're purchasing paints, do you purchase them in a recyclable metal tube versus a plastic tube? Can you get like refill pots for the watercolor palette that you have? For things like the sewing, the diaper wipes, now that my kids are no longer in diapers, have become like mess cleaning up wipes and are now so far gone and actually wholly, but they were made out of 100% cotton fabric and sewn with 100% cotton thread. So as I get really wholly ones, I'm actually just taking those outside and can compost them, can put them in our compost pile and they'll break down. So you can kind of think about those as two separate things. Where can I rehome it to be reused versus what do I do with it? Does it go in the trash can? Does it go in the recycling? Does it go in the compost? Does it go in my like rag bag or the stuffing bag that I'm going to use to stuff dog beds or floor cushions or things like that? So kind of notice that those are two separate things and think through those. And those decisions can even a little bit affect your purchasing ideas. I know that with things like markers, there are companies that will actually, you can ship them back their markers and they will sort of refill them and refurbish them and can put them out into the world again. So there are brands that can be more easily recycled or reused than other brands, which may influence what you decide to buy to begin with. Okay, so we've gone through the whole life cycle of your craft, from materials in to materials out. Now I want to talk about the actual things that you're making. So what are you making in your craft? Obviously, this depends a lot on what you want to make, but I think it's also worth thinking about what things you need in your life. For us and our family, we have gone down I'm not going to say zero waste route. Zero waste is not, in my opinion, is not even possible, but reducing waste, and especially reducing single-use waste. So like the plastic fork that you throw away rather than a metal fork. Both of those are waste, but one of them is single use and one of them is not. That's kind of where we are. So I use a lot of my crafts to help me achieve the thing that I want in the rest of my lifestyle. So just to run through what that looks like for a couple of things. Some of them are really pretty obvious. Cloth napkins. These are just sewn. This was a long ago project that I did, and it gave me some good practice of just like hemming things and making edges even and things like that. And it helped me progress in my sewing skills while also creating something. I made these 8 years ago, I think. And we have a huge bin full of cloth napkins. So that's something that reduces that. A lot of these are pretty obvious with sort of fabric things, but like hankies, like handkerchiefs to blow your nose on. To me, the thought of using our regular napkins was not something I was really interested in. So having them be a very different shape and fabric made that easier. So I made grown-up ones, and then I made kid ones that have frogs on them. So that was another thing that kind of let that less single-use things work a little bit better. This one's a little bit more extreme. We take these with us when we go out to places. They are napkins and reusable straws and cutlery wraps. And so it's just a piece of fabric that has an itty bitty little seam on it. So this was the easiest sewing project ever. You hem like a rectangle and then you sew 1 inch and make the little pocket. And then you can put just like the fork and knife that you use in your own kitchen and a reusable straw in there. And so we have one for each person, and like one kid gets foxes and one kid gets trains. So they can kind of be customized a little bit as well, which can be fun and make them be excited about doing it. And again, if you're getting a little bit more down the really reducing waste and kind of trying to approach the zero waste, if you do bulk bin shopping, this is my oatmeal bag. So this is just a sewn bag, really easy to do, but you can take these to the bulk bins and like fill it up with oatmeal and bring it home again. It can be nice with these to have someplace to write the tare weight. So like if your bag weighs 1 ounce, you can write 1 ounce on the tag, and then they know how much to subtract off of it, so you're not paying for the weight of the bag. Although cloth bags are really not that heavy, depending on what cloth you made your bag from. And again, this is my bread bag for our local bakery. I'll go in and get a loaf of bread, and I can put it straight in here, so I don't have to have the plastic bag that the bread comes in and fold it over. You can also freeze bread in here, so if you can only get to a local bakery once a month, you can buy 5 loaves of bread and freeze them. So those things work for that as well. But it doesn't just have to be for reusable things. In the sort of low waste area that you can sew things for. This is actually, I used a piece of fabric and filled it with rice, and so this is like a heating pad. I actually made it to use during labor with my children, and then hated it when I was in labor. So you can make sort of around the house things. You can sew things for your sewing hobby. So these, I used some scraps. This is a cotton sheet scraps from a different project, and this is a wool sweater that I used the other part of to make some wool diaper covers. And this is a pressing ham. So if you're going to press like curved hems and seams and things, the wool makes it not catch on fire, even if you're using high heat. which is nice. And then I also made pattern weights. So if you're doing garment sewing and you put the pattern down, you put these down on top of it to hold it flat, and then use your rotary cutter to cut around it. So they're filled with kitty litter, and they're just little fabric triangles. I also got to practice my hand sewing to close them up. It still needs a little work. I'm a machine sewer for sure. And then some other general things. My purse handle broke. So I can't decide if I'm cool enough to pull this off or not. I love this purse. I really like everything about it. But when the handle broke, this used to be one of those, you know, those big plastic bags that like cereal comes in. That's what this bag used to be, specifically Fruity Pebbles. And it's sewn. Like I folded it over and over and over and over and stitched around it and ran it through the hole that it came out of to do. So you can really do some out of the box thinking depending on how far you want to push it. And again, if I decide down the line that I don't like it, I can cut it off, and it just had a detour on its way to the landfill because I used it for a while, if not forever, as a strap. And then this was a gift for my first kid on her first birthday. It was just a big cushion that we already have. Then the back part used to be a tablecloth, and then all of the fabric was out of my fabric bin, or my scrap bin, and they've all got pockets for her to put her little toys in, and the big train. She was very into trains at the time. So you can use it not just for stuff for you, but for sort of gift giving for other people. So it very much, and then one more thing, this is my bag that my puff quilt is living in, and this used to be plastic grocery bags, like these happen to be from Kroger, and you can still read the label on there. I laid these all flat, ironed them together, it melts them together just a little bit. I'm not sure that I would absolutely recommend this. I might recommend wearing some sort of a mask. Just with the melty plastic fumes, but the verdict's still out a little bit on that one. But all of these are examples of things that let me do the crafts that I really enjoy and get something that I needed anyways. So instead of, I hit the point with quilting. I've been quilting since I was 17. I hit the point with quilting where I had enough quilts. I had enough quilts, and I had made enough quilts and given them to other people that they all had enough quilts too. And I'm not at all saying that you shouldn't keep practicing your craft if that's what you enjoy doing. But for me, I wanted to be able to personally use the thing that I was making. That's something that I get a lot of joy out of with my crafts, is to be able to use it in my everyday life. And so I started thinking, okay, I have the ability to sew 2 pieces of fabric in a straight line. What can I make now that I'm actually going to be able to use every day? Because for me personally, that was something that I liked to do with my craft. And so kind of just thinking through, okay, what do I use as I would use something up that was a single use or a disposable item? Is there some way that I could use some of the crafting ability that I have to make a replacement for that? And the answer is often yes. And even for things that don't initially present as something that fabric could do, like to make a box. You really do have the option to make a lot of things using the materials and the skills that you already have, maybe stretching yourself a little bit, like to make the footstool with the yarn or fabric scraps that I've shown you. There may be some new skills that you need to learn, but I find that enjoyable. That's part of it. Sort of pushes me to learn new aspects of the crafts that I enjoy. So for me, being able to use my craft in a way that I will be able to look at and get practical benefit in my everyday life is something that I enjoy. So I kind of try to gear my crafts in that direction a lot of the time. The very last thing that I'm going to talk to today, and I'm running right out of time, is packaging. Anytime you're buying something, especially something new for craft supplies for your materials, it's going to come in packaging. And there are often things that you can do with that packaging to give it another purpose before it needs to be thrown away. That can really help reduce the amount of energy and inputs that's going into your crafting in the form of packaging. So I've already mentioned you can reuse the package that it came in to package the gift that you are going to be giving, or if you're reselling your things, like we did with the tennis ball tube. So you can use the package that your craft supplies came in, or you can use packaging from other areas of your life, or the lives of people around you. And another thing that we have done, a lot of things come now with the like brown paper to fill the empty space. We do a lot with seed bombs. So if you mix seeds, like wildflower seeds, in with that paper and some water to kind of make a pulp, you can shape it and color it in a bunch of different ways. We use these as gifts a lot. So especially like kid gifts for like Valentine's Day at kindergarten or what have you. The point being, there are a lot of things that you can do with the packages that come with your products. And maybe kind of look at those packages as they come in and say, okay, if I open it this way, could I reuse this for something else? Could I reuse the clear plastic or the white plastic wrapper on here? Can I cut this into pieces and use those as the plant labels in my garden? Can I cut this cardboard box apart and lay it flat as a weed barrier in the garden paths? Can you tell that I've been doing a lot of gardening this year? Things like that. Can you keep the box and then use that to package something else in? Did it come in a pretty like tissue paper with a ribbon? Do you have a little place where you can put gift wrapping supplies for the next time you need to wrap a gift? Things like that. All of the 6 things that I've talked about so far in my whole lecture I'm hoping to have kind of led you down the path of just thinking about things a little bit differently. It's a practice of changing your mindset, of every time you see something, think, how could this be useful? How can I get an extra use out of this? All of our supplies that we're using in our crafts took resources to make, and they took energy to make, and energy to transport and get them to you, and all of those things. The best thing that we can do to be more sustainable with our crafting is to honor that use of resources by using it as much as we can. And so just practicing just a little bit, little pieces at a time, using that mindset differently. To how can I use what I have? How can I reuse? How can I use all of this? How can I package it? How can I use the things that it's coming in, give them all a second or a third or a fourth life, I think can be really valuable. And it can really take our crafting and make us more creative, and make us be able to enjoy the crafts that we're creating a little bit more if we're of that mindset, and that makes us feel good. Because at the end of the day, my line is always, if you're having fun,